My name is Marcus Thompson. I just bought 50 acres to end an 8-year war with the most entitled woman in Tennessee. Right now, I'm watching Delia Kramer have a complete meltdown at my brand new steel gate. Her silver BMW is trapped behind $200,000 worth of screw you, and the look on her face is worth every penny. She's been cutting through my property illegally for 8 years. 8 years of treating my retirement land like her personal shortcut to the country club. When I finally said enough and built a fence, she hit me with a $500 HOA fine for using the wrong shade of white. Antique ivory wasn't acceptable. Only Cream Dream met her standards. I'm not kidding. Those are the actual paint names she specified. That's when she made her fatal mistake. See, she assumed a retired civil engineer wouldn't know how to fight back. What she didn't know was that I'd been waiting 40 years for someone stupid enough to pick a legal fight with me. The horn from her BMW just hit the 3-minute mark. That's dedication, but here's what makes this perfect. She can honk until the heat death of the universe, and this gate will never open for her again. Because last week, I discovered something in the 1987 county records that doesn't just prove she's been trespassing. It's about to end her entire HOA presidency. And it all started with the most ridiculous paint violation in suburban history. Let me take you back 3 months to when I thought retirement meant choosing between golf and fishing, instead of waging legal warfare against the most entitled woman in Tennessee. I just moved to my dream property, 15 acres of rolling hills with a creek running through the back and enough space that I couldn't see my neighbors unless I really tried. After 40 years of designing municipal water systems and reading construction codes until my eyes bled, this was supposed to be my peaceful retreat, where the biggest decision of the day was whether to have my morning coffee on the front porch or the back deck. I should have known better than to expect peace and quiet when there's an HOA president within a 20 meters radius. The trouble started on my 3rd Tuesday morning when I was watching a family of deer graze near the creek and heard the unmistakable sound of expensive German engineering crunching across my gravel driveway. A silver BMW pulled up, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been manufactured in a suburban mom factory, complete with perfect blonde highlights, yoga pants that cost more than my monthly utility bill, and the kind of smile that immediately makes you check your wallet to make sure it's still there. She introduced herself as Delia Kramer, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and welcomed me to the neighborhood with the enthusiasm of someone selling extended warranties. That should have been my first red flag right there, because my property isn't in Willowbrook Estates and never has been. My 15 acres predates their entire development by a decade and a half, but apparently geography wasn't Delia's strong suit. She explained that she'd stopped by because there had been some concerns about my fence, gesturing toward the simple chain-link barrier I'd installed around my vegetable garden to keep the deer from turning my tomatoes into an all-you-can-eat buffet. According to Delia, my fence wasn't in compliance with community standards, which was news to me since I didn't know I was part of any community that had standards about my personal property. She consulted a clipboard that materialized from nowhere and informed me that HOA covenants required all fencing to be white vinyl minimum 6 feet in height with decorative post caps. My current fence was apparently galvanized steel mesh, approximately 4 feet high with standard metal posts, and it was affecting everyone's property values in ways that would make Adam Smith weep. Being a polite Midwestern transplant who hadn't yet learned the fine art of telling entitled people to pound sand, I made the mistake of saying I'd look into it instead of pointing out that her HOA had exactly zero authority over property that existed before her subdivision was even a gleam in some developer's eye. 2 weeks later, the violation notice arrived via certified mail with all the ceremony of a federal indictment. $500 for unauthorized fencing installation with additional daily fines of $50 after 30 days if I didn't comply with their demands. When I called the number on the letterhead to explain that my property wasn't subject to HOA oversight, Delia's cheerful phone voice turned icy faster than a Minnesota lake in January. She insisted that every property in the area fell under HOA jurisdiction and suggested I was confused about my property boundaries, which was rich coming from someone who apparently thought property law was more of a suggestion than an actual legal requirement. She offered to come over with their surveyor to clear up my obvious confusion, and like an idiot, I agreed. The next morning, Delia arrived with a man carrying surveying equipment and an attitude problem. They spent 2 hours measuring things, consulting maps, and having whispered conversations near their cars before Delia marched up to my porch and announced that while my house sat just outside their community boundaries, my fence was actually on property that fell under HOA jurisdiction. When I asked to see this miraculous survey that proved my vegetable garden had somehow moved itself into their territory overnight, she couldn't produce any actual documentation, just kept insisting that their professional analysis proved jurisdiction over my fence. That night, I did what any self-respecting engineer does when someone tries to snow them with technical nonsense that doesn't pass the smell test. I drove to the county records office first thing the next morning and pulled every property document, survey map, and legal filing dating back to 1987. What I found in those dusty files didn't just prove that Dia was lying about jurisdiction over my fence. It revealed something that would give me the perfect weapon to end her 8-year crime spree and destroy her suburban dictatorship forever. But before I tell you about that discovery, you need to understand that this wasn't really about my fence at all. This was about control, and the route Delia had been using to maintain that control was about to become very, very expensive for her. The county clerk's office smelled like old paper and forgotten dreams, but to me it was better than Christmas morning because I was about to unwrap the most beautiful revenge present in Tennessee legal history. I'd brought a thermos of coffee and settled in for what I knew would be the most productive day of my retirement, digging through 40 years of property records to prove that Dia Kramer was completely full of expensive legal nonsense. I started with my property deed from 1987, when Harold Westbrook originally purchased these 15 acres of prime real estate. The boundaries were marked by stone monuments that were probably older than disco, and there wasn't a whisper of HOA covenants anywhere in the documentation. My land was clean, clear, and completely independent of any suburban dictator's authority, which felt pretty damn good after listening to Dia's lecture about community standards. Then I pulled the Willowbrook Estates development records from 2002, 15 years after my property was already owned and occupied. The development boundaries stopped exactly at my eastern property line, like they'd hit an invisible wall with no overlap whatsoever. But that's when I found something that made me sit up straight in that creaky wooden chair and start grinning like an idiot. Buried in their construction plans was a document that would end Delia's morning routine forever. Temporary construction, easement Westbrook property access route for development phase 2, dated March 2003, with a crystal clear expiration date of 18 months maximum. Development Phase 2 was completed in December 2004, according to the county's own certificates, which meant this easement had been dead and buried for exactly 20 years. 20 years of DI driving through my property every single morning at 7:43 a.m., committing criminal trespass while lecturing me about property compliance. The irony was so beautiful, I actually started laughing out loud, and the county clerk shot me a look like maybe I was having some kind of mental episode. I kept digging through those files like a prospector who just struck gold, and every document made the situation more perfect. Environmental studies showing they'd used my land as a temporary construction route to avoid sensitive wetlands with specific legal requirements, to restore everything to original natural conditions when finished. Restoration that never happened because entitled people don't clean up their messes when they can just keep using someone else's property for free. Traffic impact assessments proving the route was never intended as permanent access, just a short-term convenience during building. But the real masterpiece was tucked away in the Willowbrook HOA Charter itself. Article 7, Section 3, written by their own expensive lawyers. The association shall maintain strict compliance with all county regulations and property law, and any violation of easement agreements or trespass upon non-member property shall result in immediate removal of board members and potential dissolution of association legal standing. Delea had been violating her own HOA's founding charter every single morning for 8 years, documenting her crimes with the consistency of a Swiss watch. She just handed me the legal dynamite to blow up her entire suburban empire, and she had absolutely no idea what was coming. Because tomorrow morning, I was going to make a phone call that would change both our lives forever. Driving home from the courthouse, with 21 pages of legal dynamite in my passenger seat, I felt like a prospector who just struck the mother lode. I had everything needed to destroy Delea's morning routine and probably end her HOA dictatorship. But as I turned into my driveway, something made me hit the brakes, both literally and figuratively. Fresh tire tracks were cutting across my back pasture in a perfect line where she trespassed again while I was at the county office documenting her 8-year crime spree. That's when the engineer in me took over from the angry property owner. I didn't just want to stop Delea Kramer from using my land as her personal highway. I wanted to trap her so completely that she'd never abuse anyone else's property rights again. Calling the sheriff about criminal trespass would solve my immediate problem, but it wouldn't address what happens to the next poor soul who gets targeted by her suburban tyranny. People like Delea don't learn from slapped wrists. They just find new victims and new ways to flex their authority until someone with bigger guns shuts them down permanently. What I needed wasn't just a fence around my property, but a strategy that would end her reign while protecting innocent Willowbrook residents who weren't part of her power games. So I started approaching this like the engineering project it really was. Those county documents weren't just evidence. They were construction blueprints for something much bigger. That HOA charter clause about automatic removal for property law violations wasn't accidental language. Smart lawyers had built in a nuclear option for exactly this situation, knowing what kind of personalities get drunk on homeowner association power. But timing nuclear options requires strategic positioning to avoid collateral damage. I needed leverage, giving me complete control while offering DIA a face-saving exit if she was intelligent enough to recognize checkmate when she saw it, something benefiting the entire community, whether she chose cooperation or total destruction. That's when I remembered the for sale sign on County Road 847 that I'd noticed driving to the courthouse. 50 acres of prime undeveloped land sitting right against my eastern boundary, controlling every deer trail, back road, and unofficial shortcut between Willowbrook Estates and civilization. The asking price was $200,000, steep for undeveloped property, and way outside any reasonable retirement budget. But I wasn't thinking about reasonable anymore. I was thinking about the most expensive chess move in Tennessee history, positioning myself to control every square on the board, while Delea played checkers with her fake surveys and expired easements. That property would give me something more valuable than money could buy. Complete tactical superiority over someone who'd spent 8 years thinking she was untouchable. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the real estate sign. Some games are worth whatever they cost to win, and this one was about to become very expensive for the right person. Patterson Real Estate, this is Jennifer speaking, and she sounded like someone who hadn't fielded a serious inquiry about the Hartwell property since the Clinton administration. I explained I was interested in the 50-acre parcel on County Road 847, and she practically jumped through the phone with enthusiasm, asking if I was looking to build a house. I told her something like that, which was technically accurate if you consider building the perfect legal trap a form of residential construction. 2 hours later, I was standing on a hilltop overlooking the most beautiful piece of strategic real estate in Tennessee history. The Hartwell property wrapped around Willowbrook Estates like a military noose, controlling every deer trail, back road, and unofficial shortcut between the subdivision and civilization. Most importantly, it controlled the exact route that Delia had been using for her 8-year crime spree, the path that was about to become as accessible as Fort Knox. Jennifer walked me through the boundaries, explaining that the previous owner had used it for hunting, and that the only legal access was through the main gate on County Road 847. When I asked about that old trail cutting through the eastern section, she confirmed what I already knew from the county records. Not a real road, just abandoned construction access from Willowbrook development that should have been restored to natural conditions 2 decades ago. I looked at this woman who had no idea she was about to witness the most expensive revenge purchase in county history and told her I'd take it. Jennifer's clipboard hit the ground like she'd been struck by lightning, and she asked if I was seriously planning to buy $200,000 worth of undeveloped land without sleeping on it, getting a survey, or consulting anyone with basic financial sense. I explained that I was a widow rower with excellent credit and a very specific use for strategic real estate, which was ending the criminal career of Tennessee's most entitled trespasser. The paperwork took 3 hours, during which I signed documents transferring more money than most people spend on houses into what was essentially the world's most expensive gate across someone else's driveway. Closing was scheduled for Friday, giving me exactly 10 days to orchestrate infrastructure that would make the Berlin Wall look like a garden fence. I spent the next week throwing retirement money at contractors like a drunken lottery winner. Fence 8 Construction got the call for 8 feet chain link around 50 acres with barbed wire on top and industrial locks that could stop a tank. Precision Security Systems designed a perimeter monitoring system with motion sensors and cameras that would make the Pentagon jealous. Hartwell Monument Company produced 20 private property signs large enough to be read from low Earth orbit. Every contractor asked the same question about timeline, and I gave them the same answer. Money, no object. Rush job bonuses, whatever it takes to finish by next Friday. Some people spend their retirement savings on boats or vacations to Europe. I was spending mine on the most satisfying property rights enforcement project in American legal history. Friday morning, I sat in the closing attorney's office, signing papers that would make me the owner of Delia Kramer's worst nightmare. As I transferred enough money to buy a decent house into 50 acres of strategic superiority, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was so perfect, I actually started laughing out loud in that quiet legal office. Mr. Thompson, this is Dia Kramer. Your fence violations have escalated beyond acceptable limits. Meet me at your property line tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. This situation ends now one way or another. I showed the text to the closing attorney, who asked what was so funny about someone threatening me. I explained that it wasn't a threat. It was a formal invitation to watch someone walk directly into the most expensive trap in Tennessee history. Saturday morning, 7:55 a.m. Sharp. I was standing at my property line with a thermos of coffee and 21 pages of legal ammunition, watching Delia's silver BMW approach like a heat-seeking missile locked onto its target. The engine shut off with that expensive German precision that only comes from decades of automotive engineering, and outstepped our suburban dictator, wearing what could only be described as her full battle regalia: power blazer that screamed expensive lawyer money, designer heels completely inappropriate for walking on Tennessee grass, and a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. Behind her emerged this nervous-looking man in pressed khakis carrying professional surveying equipment. And I felt genuinely sorry for the poor bastard, because he had absolutely no idea he was about to become collateral damage in the most expensive property rights war in county history. Delia marched across my lawn with the supreme confidence of someone who'd never encountered real opposition in her entire HOA career. Her stiletto heels punching perfect little holes in my grass with each determined step. She stopped exactly 6 feet into my property and announced in her most authoritative voice that we were finally going to resolve this fence situation like civilized adults who understood how community standards worked in the real world. I took a slow sip of coffee and agreed enthusiastically, then casually mentioned that she was currently committing criminal trespass by standing on my private property without any written permission from the actual landowner. You should have seen her freeze mid-stride like someone had pressed a pause button on her entire personality. Her perfectly composed suburban mom mask cracked just enough to show the entitled rage simmering underneath before she launched into what was obviously a carefully prepared speech about my fence violating established community standards, me being deliberately uncooperative with reasonable compliance requests, and how I was now maliciously interfering with established traffic patterns that benefited the entire neighborhood and promoted efficient transportation. When I asked her to clarify exactly what she meant by established traffic patterns, she actually said it out loud with complete confidence, explaining that responsible residents had been using the convenient access route through my back property for years to reach the main road efficiently without disrupting traffic flow on other streets. I pulled out my phone and started recording, asking her to confirm on camera that she was specifically referring to the route that crossed my private property without any legal easement, written agreement, or documented permission from me as the property owner. That's when she opened her briefcase with obvious dramatic flair and produced this impressively thick manila folder, announcing that her expensive legal team had prepared comprehensive documentation that definitively proved my interference with community access constituted a clear public nuisance under multiple sections of Tennessee state law. She handed me 15 pages of the most impressively manufactured legal fiction I'd ever encountered, complete with professional letterhead from a real law firm, official-looking stamps, and enough legal jargon to choke an entire law school graduating class. The document was professionally titled Legal Analysis of Property Access Rights and covered everything from adverse possession theory to prescriptive easement doctrine to community benefit standards under various municipal code sections and subsections. Someone had definitely invested serious money manufacturing this elaborate pile of legal nonsense, and it would have been genuinely intimidating to anyone who hadn't spent the previous week learning what actual property law looked like when it wasn't filtered through entitled suburban logic. I flipped through their impressive analysis while explaining in my most helpful voice that they seemed to have overlooked something rather important in their otherwise thorough research. When she demanded to know what that might possibly be, I pulled out my own folder containing the original temporary construction easement from March 2003, reading directly from the official county document that specifically stated the access route was limited exclusively to development vehicle traffic during Phase 2 construction and legally required complete restoration to original natural conditions upon project completion in December 2004. The easement had been officially dead and buried for exactly 20 years, which meant every single use of this route since then constituted criminal trespassing under Tennessee Code, Section 3,914,105, not continuous legal usage establishing any kind of prescriptive rights under legitimate legal theory. Delaya's face went through approximately 6 different shades of red, while her surveyor suddenly stopped setting up his expensive equipment and shot her this uncomfortable look like he was beginning to understand exactly what kind of legal quicksand he'd wandered into. She tried arguing that circumstances had obviously changed over 2 decades, and property law was much more flexible than I was suggesting. But I patiently explained that's not how easements work in Tennessee or any other state where property rights actually mean something substantial. You absolutely cannot establish legal right to use someone else's land based on consistently breaking the law for 20 years, regardless of how convenient it makes your daily commute to the country club. That's when she decided to escalate things by calling the county planning department right there in front of me, filing an official complaint about illegal obstruction of what she claimed was a recognized public access route. I just stood there sipping my coffee and enjoying the free entertainment, waiting for that beautiful moment when they would patiently explain that no such public access route existed anywhere in their comprehensive record system. After about 5 minutes of increasingly frustrated questions and demands that they check their files again more carefully, she hung up, looking like someone had just explained that her entire worldview was built on a foundation of complete legal nonsense. Her surveyor, Michael, finished his professional boundary measurements and walked over wearing the most uncomfortable expression I'd ever seen on any professional's face. He confirmed that property lines were exactly as recorded in the official county files, with no legal access route crossing my land anywhere. And when Dia suggested he should create documentation for a prescriptive easement claim, he explained that would constitute criminal fraud, and he wasn't willing to risk his professional license for anyone's convenience. That's when I decided to detonate the nuclear bomb that would end this conversation permanently and destroy her entire morning routine forever. I told her that since she seemed so intensely interested in property boundaries and access rights, she might want to know that I'd successfully closed on the Hartwell property yesterday afternoon. Monday morning arrived like the opening scene of a war movie, and I was standing in my kitchen, watching through the window as 3 different contractor trucks rolled up to begin what would become known in local folklore as the Great Fence Project of 2025. Fence construction brought equipment that looked like it could secure a federal prison. Precision Security arrived with enough cameras to film a Hollywood movie, and Hartwell Monument delivered signs so large they were probably visible from the International Space Station. The whole operation had the precision of a military campaign, which was exactly what I'd been planning since I discovered DIA's 8-year crime spree in the county records. By 9 a.m., the sounds of industrial construction were echoing across 50 acres of strategic real estate, and I was having the time of my retirement life, watching my $200,000 revenge project take shape. 8 feet chain link sections going up faster than you could say property rights. Motion sensors being installed every 100 feet like electronic sentries, and those beautiful aluminum signs being mounted at every conceivable access point, with messages that would make any trespasser think twice about their life choices. That's when Delea made her first tactical error of the week by driving up to the construction site in her BMW and demanding to speak with whoever was in charge of this obvious violation of county building codes. The fence right-tight foreman, a guy named Bobby, who looked like he'd been installing barriers since the invention of private property, politely explained that all permits were properly filed and approved. All work was being performed within legal property boundaries, and she needed to move her car because it was blocking equipment access on private land. Delea's response was to call the county building inspector, the sheriff's department, and apparently every regulatory agency in Tennessee that might possibly have jurisdiction over fence installation on private property. What she discovered over the next 2 hours of increasingly frantic phone calls was that I'd done my homework better than a doctoral dissertation, filing every required permit, meeting every code requirement, and documenting every aspect of this project with the thoroughness that only comes from 40 years of engineering experience. Tuesday brought escalation number 2 when I discovered fresh tire tracks cutting across my original 15 acres, proving that Dia was so desperate to maintain her illegal shortcut that she'd started trespassing on a different section of my property while the main route was being fortified. The audacity was breathtaking, like a bank robber deciding to hit the same bank through the back door while police were installing security cameras at the front entrance. I called Bobby the foreman and asked him to extend the fence line to include my original property boundary, effectively creating one continuous 55-acre fortress of property rights enforcement. Wednesday morning brought Delea's most desperate move yet, when she arrived with a different surveyor. This time claiming that recent county records showed errors in the original property boundaries, and that significant portions of both my properties were actually part of an expanded Willowbrook Estates development zone. She waved around official-looking documents that would have been impressive if they weren't completely fabricated, demanding that construction stop immediately until boundary disputes could be resolved through proper legal channels. I invited her new surveyor to compare his mysterious documents with the certified copies I'd obtained directly from the county clerk's office, watching his professional credibility evaporate faster than morning dew when he realized his client had apparently hired him to validate fictional property lines. The poor man apologized, packed up his equipment, and drove away, leaving Delia standing alone next to my fence with her fabricated paperwork. An expression like someone who just discovered that reality doesn't bend to entitled expectations. Thursday escalated into what I can only describe as Delia's complete meltdown when she showed up with bolt cutters and started attempting to remove sections of my fence that she claimed were illegally installed on HOA property. Bobby the foreman called the sheriff's department while I stood there documenting everything with my phone, creating a beautiful video record of Tennessee's most entitled woman committing criminal property damage in broad daylight. Deputy Rodriguez arrived within 15 minutes and explained to Delia that destroying someone else's fence on their private property constituted criminal mischief under state law, regardless of whatever imaginary property rights she thought she possessed. The look on her face when Deputy Rodriguez asked if she wanted to be arrested for criminal mischief, or if she'd prefer to leave peacefully, was the kind of expression you see on people who suddenly realize their actions have actual legal consequences. She chose to leave, but not before screaming something about expensive lawyers and federal property rights violations that would apparently shut down my entire project through superior legal firepower. Friday morning brought the grand finale when Delia arrived with a moving truck and two men who looked like they'd been hired from the day labor pool outside Home Depot. Her brilliant plan, as near as I could determine, was to physically relocate sections of my fence to create her own personal access route through what she had somehow convinced herself was disputed territory. I watched through my kitchen window as these poor guys started unloading shovels and crowbars while Delia directed them toward my fence line like some suburban general planning an assault on private property rights. That's when I made a phone call that would change everything about this ridiculous situation. I dialed Sarah Kai's number and explained that my fence project had apparently attracted the attention of someone who thought criminal property damage was an acceptable solution to traffic inconvenience. Sarah asked if I had documentation of the destruction attempts, and I told her I had video evidence that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. She said she'd be right over with paperwork that would end this nonsense permanently, and I told her she might want to bring a camera crew because this was about to become the most educational property law demonstration in Tennessee history. Sarah Kai arrived at my property Friday afternoon, driving like she was responding to a 5-alarm legal emergency, which in a way she was because Delia's fence destruction project was still in progress when my attorney's Honda pulled into the driveway. Sarah stepped out carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of expression that defense attorneys get when they realize their client has just confessed to murder on live television. She took one look at Delia directing 2-day laborers to dismantle my fence with crowbars and started laughing so hard I thought she might need medical attention. Within 20 minutes, Sarah had documented everything with her phone, taken statements from Bobby the foreman and his crew, collected physical evidence of the damaged fence sections, and explained to Delia's hired muscle that they were currently committing felony destruction of property on camera and might want to consider alternative employment opportunities. The day laborers dropped their tools faster than hot potatoes and disappeared in their pickup truck, leaving Delia standing alone next to my fence, holding a crowbar and looking like someone who just realized that reality has consequences. Sarah introduced herself as my legal counsel and politely suggested that Delia might want to contact her own attorney before continuing her property destruction project, because what she was currently doing constituted multiple felonies under Tennessee criminal law.
Delea's response was to claim that she was exercising legitimate property rights under HOA authority,
and that any interference with her activities would result in federal lawsuits for violation of community access rights under interstate commerce regulations. That's when Sarah pulled out her phone and made a call that would turn this local property dispute into a statewide news story. She contacted Rita Walsh, an investigative journalist who specialized in suburban corruption and HOA abuse cases, explaining that she had documentation of what appeared to be an 8-year pattern of criminal trespassing combined with attempted destruction of private property by an elected HOA official. Rita said she'd be there within 2 hours with a camera crew because stories about entitled HOA presidents committing crimes on camera were exactly the kind of content that made local news directors extremely happy. Saturday morning brought the beautiful sight of Channel 7 news van pulling up to my property, followed immediately by Rita Walsh and a cameraman who looked like he'd been covering crime scenes since the invention of television journalism. Rita interviewed Sarah about the legal implications of HOA officials trespassing on private property, talked to Bobby about the fence destruction attempts, and got Deputy Rodriguez on record, explaining that criminal mischief charges were definitely being considered against certain unnamed individuals. The story that aired Sunday evening was a masterpiece of investigative journalism titled HOA President Accused of Chronic Trespassing and Property Damage. Rita had done her homework, pulling county records that documented the expired easement, interviewing legal experts who explained that 20 years of illegal usage doesn't create legal rights, and presenting the whole situation as a cautionary tale about what happens when elected officials think authority means immunity from property law. But the real beautiful part came Monday morning, when my phone started ringing with calls from other Willowbrook residents who'd been watching the news and wanted to share their own stories about Dia's creative interpretations of HOA authority. Apparently, our fence dispute had opened floodgates of complaints about financial irregularities, vote manipulation, and selective enforcement of community rules that benefited Delea's friends while punishing anyone who questioned her decisions. By Tuesday, the Tennessee State HOA Oversight Commission had announced they were launching a formal investigation into Willowbrook Estates management practices, and Delea's 8-year reign of suburban tyranny was about to become the subject of official state scrutiny that would make my fence project look like a minor property disagreement. Wednesday morning brought the most beautiful phone call of my entire retirement, when Sarakai's voice practically vibrated with excitement through my speaker. The Tennessee State HOA Oversight Commission had spent exactly 48 hours reviewing the evidence Rita Walsh's news story had generated, and what they discovered made my fence dispute look like a parking ticket compared to federal racketeering charges. Apparently, other Willowbrook residents had been documenting Delea's creative leadership style for years, just waiting for someone brave enough or stupid enough to challenge her authority publicly. The state investigators had found financial irregularities dating back 3 years, including community improvement funds that had mysteriously vanished into projects that seemed to benefit properties owned by Dia's personal friends. Vote manipulation during HOA board elections were proxy ballots from residents who DE moved away years earlier somehow kept appearing to support Delea's preferred candidates. Selective enforcement of community standards that resulted in expensive fines for people who'd questioned her decisions, while identical violations by her supporters went completely unnoticed. But the real bombshell was hidden in the HOA's own meeting minutes, which Sarah had subpoenaed as part of our property dispute case. Those minutes revealed that Delea had been using her position to negotiate personal benefits from local contractors, including the landscaping company that maintained her property for free in exchange for exclusive HOA contracts. the waste management service that gave her family discounted rates while charging other residents premium fees. Even the security company that monitored the subdivision had been providing free monitoring for Delea's house while billing the association for services never rendered. Thursday brought news that made me actually dance a little jig in my kitchen when Sarah called to explain that the State Commission had issued an emergency suspension of Willowbrook Estates' legal standing as a recognized homeowners association. Effective immediately, they had no authority to issue violations, collect fines, or enforce any community standards until a complete audit could be performed and new leadership elected under state supervision. This meant that every violation notice DI had ever issued, including my ridiculous fence color fine, was now legally invalid. Every fine she'd collected over the past 3 years would need to be refunded with interest. Every contract she'd negotiated on behalf of the association was subject to review for potential fraud. Her entire suburban empire had collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane, and the beautiful irony was that it had all started with her illegal shortcut through my vegetable garden. Friday morning brought the cuttigrass when Deputy Rodriguez called to inform me that the district attorney's office had decided to file criminal charges against Delea for the fence destruction incident. Criminal mischief in the first degree, trespassing and conspiracy to commit property damage were apparently serious enough crimes that bail set at $50,000. The same woman who'd lectured me about community standards was now facing the possibility of criminal conviction and jail time for destroying private property. But wait, it gets even better. Sarah had been busy researching Delea's background for our civil case, and what she'd discovered would make any prosecutor's career. This wasn't Delea's first HOA presidency, and it wasn't her first ethics investigation either. She'd left 2 previous communities under similar clouds of financial irregularities and resident complaints, always managing to move on before formal charges could be filed. This time, however, she'd picked the wrong retired engineer to mess with, and her pattern of suburban tyranny was finally catching up with her. The State Commission's preliminary report, released the following Monday, was a 73-page document that read like a master class in how not to run a homeowners association: financial mismanagement, abuse of authority, violation of state regulations governing nonprofit organizations, and failure to maintain required documentation for community decisions. They recommended complete dissolution of the current HOA structure, election of new leadership under state oversight, and potential criminal prosecution for multiple current and former board members. Tuesday brought my favorite news of the entire saga, when Sarah called to read me the official notice that had been posted on every door in Willowbrook Estates. Due to criminal investigation and state regulatory violations, all HOA authority was suspended indefinitely. All pending violations were canceled. All collected fines from the past 3 years would be refunded with statutory interest, and residents were advised to seek independent legal counsel if they believed they'd been victims of association misconduct. The notice also included a phone number for reporting additional complaints to the State Commission. And according to Rita Walsh's follow-up news story, that phone line had been ringing non-stop since Tuesday morning. Apparently, Delea's reign of terror had affected far more people than anyone had realized, and my simple fence dispute had opened the floodgates for justice that was 20 years overdue. Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after Dia had tried to destroy my fence with crowbars and day laborers, I was standing in my kitchen drinking coffee and watching Channel 7 News report that Tennessee's most infamous HOA president had been arrested at her home and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and racketeering under state organized crime statutes. Thursday morning brought an emergency notification that would become the most entertaining event of my entire retirement when the newly appointed state receiver for Willowbrook Estates called to inform me that a mandatory community meeting had been scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the local community center. Every resident was required to attend, to hear the findings of the state investigation, vote on new leadership under official supervision, and address outstanding legal issues affecting the association's future. I marked my calendar with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting 3 months to watch justice served with all the ceremony it deserved. Saturday afternoon arrived with the crisp clarity of a Tennessee autumn day, and the community center parking lot looked like a suburban refugee camp as confused Willowbrook residents gathered to learn exactly how much damage their elected leadership had inflicted on their property values and legal standing. I arrived early with Sarah Kai and Rita Walsh, who'd convinced her news director that this meeting would provide the perfect conclusion to her investigative series on HOA corruption. The camera crew set up in the back of the room, while residents filed in wearing expressions ranging from curious to absolutely furious. State Receiver Margaret Thompson took the podium at exactly 2 p.m. and began reading from a prepared statement that would demolish DIA's reputation so completely that archaeologists would need carbon dating to find the remains. The investigation had uncovered financial irregularities totaling over $400,000, including community improvement funds diverted to personal accounts, contractor kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, and insurance fraud involving claims for property damage that had never actually occurred. Every resident in that room went dead silent as the numbers kept climbing like a slot machine hitting the corruption jackpot. But the really beautiful part came when Receiver Thompson started reading specific examples of Dilia's creative accounting practices. Landscaping contracts that charged the association premium rates while providing cut-rate service to properties owned by board members and their families. Security monitoring fees for equipment that had never been installed, creating a fictional paper trail that existed only in billing statements and bank transfers. Maintenance assessments for community facilities that had been permanently closed to residents while continuing to generate invoices for services never rendered. The room erupted into the kind of angry murmuring you hear when people realized they've been systematically robbed by someone they'd trusted with their community leadership. Voices started rising as residents compared notes about suspicious assessments, unexplained fee increases, and community decisions that had been made without proper notification or voting procedures. What had started as confused curiosity was rapidly transforming into the kind of mob justice that makes politicians nervous. That's when Receiver Thompson dropped the nuclear bomb that would end Dilia's career permanently and provide me with the most satisfying moment of this entire legal adventure. The investigation had discovered that Dilia's pattern of financial misconduct extended far beyond simple embezzlement into systematic violation of Tennessee nonprofit regulations. Federal tax law governing homeowners associations, and state criminal statutes covering organized theft from community organizations. Criminal charges had been filed by the district attorney's office. Federal tax authorities were conducting their own investigation, and civil lawsuits were being prepared to recover stolen funds. But here's where the story gets really beautiful. Because Receiver Thompson had saved the best revelation for last. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Dilia had been using her HOA position to manipulate property assessments for tax purposes, working with a corrupt county assessor to artificially inflate values for properties owned by residents who opposed her, while reducing assessments for properties owned by supporters. This wasn't just HOA corruption. It was systematic tax fraud that had been stealing money from county schools, emergency services, and infrastructure maintenance for at least 5 years. The federal implications were staggering because property tax manipulation crosses state lines when it affects federal programs funded through local property assessments. Mail fraud charges were being considered for using postal service to distribute fraudulent assessment notices, wire fraud for electronic transfers of stolen community funds, even RICO violations for operating what federal prosecutors were calling an ongoing criminal enterprise disguised as community leadership. That's when someone in the audience asked the question I'd been waiting to hear since this entire saga began. What about the property access issues that had started this investigation? And specifically, what legal standing did the association have to enforce easement claims on private property outside their jurisdiction? Receiver Thompson's answer was music to my ears as she explained that the association had no legal authority whatsoever over property outside their recorded boundaries, that the temporary construction easement had expired in 2004, and that any attempt to claim prescriptive rights based on 20 years of illegal trespassing would be laughed out of any legitimate court in Tennessee. But she wasn't finished destroying DeLea's legal foundation because the state investigation had also discovered that the HOA's own bylaws specifically prohibited board members from using association resources for personal benefit, including legal fees to pursue property disputes unrelated to legitimate community business. Every dollar DIA had spent on lawyers to challenge my fence had been stolen from the Community Improvement Fund, making her legal threats against me a form of embezzlement in addition to trespassing. The meeting erupted into chaos as residents realized the full scope of corruption that had been operating under their noses for years. People were shouting questions about their own assessment irregularities, demanding to know which contracts needed to be canceled and calling for immediate criminal prosecution of everyone who'd enabled this systematic theft. Receiver Thompson pounded her gavel and explained that criminal justice would proceed through proper legal channels, but the community's immediate priority was electing new leadership and implementing financial controls to prevent future corruption. The nomination process for new board members was like watching democracy in action, as residents nominated neighbors they actually trusted instead of whoever had the most expensive campaign literature. The voting was conducted under state supervision with paper ballots and independent counting, producing results that would have been impossible under DIA's regime of proxy manipulation and procedural gaming. But the most satisfying moment of the entire meeting came when Receiver Thompson read the final component of the state's corrective action plan. All property violations issued by the previous board were officially can-led. All fines collected over the past 3 years would be refunded with statutory interest, calculated from the date of collection, and any legal actions initiated by the association against individual property owners were immediately dismissed with prejudice. My fence color violation was officially dead, my legal fees would be reimbursed by the state receiver, and DeLea's entire campaign of harassment had been transformed into a criminal case that would follow her for the rest of her life. The room erupted into applause that lasted so long Receiver Thompson had to pound her gavel again to restore order. As residents filed out discussing the evening's revelations, Rita Walsh approached me for a final interview that would conclude her investigative series. She asked how it felt to see justice prevail after months of harassment, and I explained that sometimes the best defense against abuse of authority is simply knowing the law better than people who think authority exempts them from legal consequences. The real victory wasn't just stopping Diaz trespassing or getting my fence violation can-led. The real victory was proving that in America, property rights still mean something and entitled people can't simply steal what they want through bureaucratic intimidation and fake legal authority. Sometimes you have to spend $200,000 in 3 months of your retirement to make that point. But some principles are worth whatever they cost to defend. As I drove home past my beautiful new fence with its motion sensors and security cameras, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of DeLea sitting in a county jail cell, contemplating her transition from suburban dictator to convicted felon. Justice had been served with all the ceremony it deserved, and my property rights were more secure than Fort Knox, thanks to the most expensive legal education Tennessee had ever provided to an entitled HOA president. 6 months after the most expensive property rights education in Tennessee history, I was standing on that same hilltop overlooking 50 acres of prime real estate that had transformed from a battlefield into something much more beautiful and meaningful for the entire community. The industrial fence and security cameras were still there, protecting the boundaries that had cost Delia Kramer her freedom and her reputation. But what had grown up around them was exactly the kind of positive outcome that makes expensive legal victories worth every penny of retirement savings. The new Willowbrook HOA board, elected under state supervision and consisting of actual neighbors instead of power-hungry bureaucrats, had approached me in March with a proposal that restored my faith in what community leadership could accomplish when it wasn't corrupted by personal agendas and financial theft. They'd been working with the County Planning Commission to address the legitimate transportation issues that had made Delia's illegal shortcut attractive in the first place, and they wanted to discuss creating a proper solution that would benefit everyone, while respecting actual property rights. Their proposal was elegant in its simplicity and respect for legal boundaries. Instead of demanding illegal access through private property, they'd negotiated with the county to improve the main road infrastructure, adding a traffic light and turning lanes that would eliminate the 12-minute delay that had motivated 20 years of criminal trespassing. The project would be funded through legitimate community assessments approved by proper voting procedures, not stolen from community improvement funds through embezzlement and creative accounting. But the really beautiful part was their request to lease a small portion of my 50-acre property for a community emergency access route that would be properly surveyed, legally documented, and maintained according to county standards. They offered fair market lease payments, liability insurance, and a contract that could be terminated by either party with reasonable notice. Everything Dia should have done 20 years ago, if she'd understood that property rights require negotiation, not theft. I agreed to their proposal with one additional condition that would transform this property dispute into lasting community benefit. Instead of monthly lease payments, I wanted the HOA to establish a scholarship fund for local high school students pursuing engineering or law degrees, specifically for kids who might not otherwise afford college education. The money saved on lease payments would accumulate annually, providing educational opportunities that would outlast all of us and create positive impact for generations. The scholarship program launched in September, with enough funding to provide full tuition assistance for 2 students per year at any Tennessee State University. The first recipients were Maria Gonzalez, who wanted to study civil engineering like the crazy old guy who'd fought the HOA, and James Patterson, who planned to become a property rights attorney after watching how legal knowledge had triumphed over bureaucratic corruption in his own neighborhood. But the transformation didn't stop with emergency access and educational funding, because 50 acres of prime real estate provides opportunities for community benefit that go far beyond resolving transportation disputes. Working with the County Parks Department and environmental conservation groups, we developed a comprehensive land use plan that would preserve natural habitat while creating recreational opportunities for families throughout the region. 20 acres along the creek became a certified wildlife preserve, protecting the deer and turkey populations that had originally attracted hunters to this property. 15 acres were designated for community gardens where families could grow vegetables and teach children about sustainable agriculture. 10 acres became a nature education center with walking trails and outdoor classroom facilities for local schools to use for environmental science programs. The remaining 5 acres, strategically positioned to control all access routes, stayed exactly as they were with industrial fencing and security monitoring, serving as a permanent reminder that property rights in America are not suggestions to be ignored by entitled officials who mistake authority for ownership. The cameras and motion sensors that had once been designed to catch trespassers now monitored the wildlife preserve and education center, protecting community assets instead of defending against community threats. The grand opening celebration in October brought together hundreds of families for the kind of community event that actually builds relationships instead of generating legal fees. Kids were running around the nature trails, while parents toured the community gardens and environmental education facilities. Local news coverage focused on how property disputes could be resolved through cooperation and respect for legal boundaries instead of years of expensive litigation and criminal prosecution. Rita Walsh returned to cover the celebration for a follow-up story about positive outcomes from investigative journalism, interviewing families who were using the community gardens and students who'd received scholarship assistance. Her final report emphasized how understanding property law and standing up to corruption could create lasting benefits that strengthened entire communities instead of just resolving individual disputes. As the sun set over the most expensive and most satisfying real estate investment of my retirement, I couldn't help but think about Delia Kramer, serving her 18-month sentence in federal prison for tax fraud and embezzlement. Sometimes justice requires patience, substantial financial investment, and willingness to fight entitled people who think authority exempts them from legal consequences. But the results can transform entire communities in ways that last generations. 1 year later, I'm sitting on my back porch with morning coffee, watching kids from the environmental education program learning about wildlife conservation where Delia Kramer used to commit her daily crimes against property rights. The irony is beautiful in ways I never imagined when this adventure started with a ridiculous fine for wrong shade of white paint. The scholarship fund now supports 4 students annually, with Maria Gonzalez sending updates from engineering school and James Patterson interning at Sarah Kai's law firm. Community gardens produce enough vegetables for the local food bank, and the wildlife preserve attracts bird watchers from 3 counties who come to see species that disappeared during years of illegal vehicle traffic. Delia was released from federal prison last month and moved to Florida. Apparently, deciding Tennessee property law was too complicated for someone with her flexible relationship to legal boundaries. The new HOA board sends Christmas cards and meeting invites, refreshing change from violation notices for exercising constitutional rights. The best part is watching families enjoy facilities that exist, because sometimes you must spend retirement savings proving entitled people can't steal through bureaucratic intimidation. Property rights in America still mean something, but only when people defend them with knowledge, patience, and occasionally expensive legal education for suburban dictators. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought authority meant immunity from law? Drop a comment about handling entitled neighbors who confused community leadership with personal ownership of other people's property. Sometimes the best stories come from ordinary people who refuse to let bureaucrats steal their rights. That's all for today's HOA madness. If watching justice serve itself made your day, smash that like button, share your thoughts down below, and make sure you're subscribed. More outrageous neighborhood showdowns are just around the corner.